among all of his books are called Holy Worldliness. And he recently also revised and put out Uncommon Decency, which you can see at our book table. And it's the right time for us to talk about civil discourse in civic manner. So he's been the president of Fuller Theological Seminary for 17 years. Just came back from the Barack Obama's President's Breakfast in DC, and we really appreciate you showing up and taking your busy time to meet our hunger and quench our thirst. So everybody, let's welcome Dr. Richard J. Mouw.
Thank you, Young Lee. We're just delighted to be gathered together here for this occasion. This is the kind of gathering and the kind of discussion that is very important to Fuller Theological Seminary's mission. I want to say a few things about that, but before I do, I'd like to introduce a good friend of mine who is, I hope, very close to being a new colleague here at Fuller Theological Seminary. We have been on a search for a new ethics professor, and as we reviewed all of the applications, I'm told by my colleagues that this person came to the top of the pile very quickly, and we've had all of the necessary process over the last a couple of months, and we're in the process right now of finalizing this appointment. And I asked him if he would fly out here from New Brunswick Theological Seminary in New Jersey to greet you today, bring just a few words of greeting. But Professor Hak Jun Lee was my translator a couple of years ago when I gave the very first Underwood lectures in South Korea. And after spending almost 2 weeks with him, I came away with a deep desire to see him come to Fuller Theological Seminary, and I'm glad that my colleagues have confirmed that assessment and have given him the call. Hak Jun Lee has his PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary in ethics and has been teaching at New Brunswick Theological Seminary, and we're hoping that next fall he will be here on our faculty. Very exciting thing that he's been involved in is the co-author of a new curriculum called a Christian Curriculum for Korean American Youth. And it's a very culturally savvy curriculum for young people, first and second generation Korean young people, introducing them to the challenges of discipleship as people growing out of an immigrant community, the challenges of discipleship and the call to leadership in North American culture. And he can maybe just say another couple of words about that. But please join me in greeting Professor Hak Jun Lee.
Thank you, Dr. Richard Mouw, for your kind introduction. Also, it is my honor and privilege to be part of this wonderful occasion under the leadership of Tim Chang and Dr. Young Hurtig. I came here just last night, partly also selfish motive. I'm escaping all the snowstorms and other things to enjoy the wonderful weather of Los Angeles. I believe we're living in the wonderful time of history. Let me just briefly share one article I read from Justo Gonzalez. He said Jesus' movement took place in the context of much more smaller version of globalization took place around the Mediterranean Sea. Greco-Roman world, clashes of different religions and cultures. There, Jesus and his disciples took up the cosmopolitan, universalistic message of gospel, but deeply rooted in the incarnational model of Jesus Christ. And I believe that Apostle Paul played such a wonderful role, showing the power and imagination of Christianity through the diaspora community. And I believe that's from my perspective, is what Asian Americans are called to live out. Deeply rooted in Christian tradition, but living in the cross currents of Asian tradition and also European tradition, that what's the calling of us in 21st century to raise our children to go out, share the wonderful message of Jesus Christ in this globalizing society. I'm definitely first generation, but my spirituality is not confined to first generation church. I'm willing to, and also, especially because of Jesus Christ, reaching out, engaging with other communities, not only other Asian American communities, but including also Hispanic and African American communities, to think about what is to be a church in this context. So from that perspective, as Dr. Mouw introduced, I started to work on this curriculum for Korean American youth, especially this intergenerational tension and conflict taking place in many Korean churches, that despite the passion and the dedication of first generation Christians, many times second generation still continue silent exodus. So I believe that's the moment where theological educational institutions like Fuller and also research institute like Isaac gathered together to think about how to equip next generation of Christians only for the glory of God. So I'm deeply honored for this occasion, and by God's providence, I believe, that I continue to be part of this wonderful ministry and have opportunity to get to know you and learn from you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I should say one of Hak Jun Lee's publications is a study of Martin Luther King, and he is a very popular speaker in black churches on Martin Luther King Day. So that's a value-added intercultural, cross-cultural sensitivity that we very much need. That conversation between Asian Americans, African Americans, Hispanic Americans is a very important conversation today. But here we're gathered to talk about Asian American ministries and the leadership of Asian American Christians in North American culture. This afternoon, we're going to be, I left my speeches someplace. But anyway, it's okay. I can. Yeah. I was going to give a fundraising speech instead, but in conversation with young Lee Herdick, she said, "Why don't we just talk about how we preserve, in a good way, how we preserve the memories of our ethnic past." And as she pointed out, one of the challenging passages in this regard is Philippians 3, where the Apostle Paul talks about the fact that he has very good reasons for boasting about what he has in the flesh, that phrase, in the flesh. He says he was circumcised on the 8th day, member of the people of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, and on and on. And then he makes this startlingly bold statement, "Yet whatever gains I had, these I have come to regard as loss because of Christ." That ethnic reception, he now is willing to count as loss in order to receive the gains of Christ. He says, "I regard everything as loss because of the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. For his sake I have suffered the loss of all things." And then this, "and I regard them as rubbish in order that I might gain Christ." Well, do we want those of you gathered here to think of your Korean past, your Chinese past, your Japanese past, your Indonesian past, the Thai, Cambodian, Vietnamese, that's just rubbish because now I've got Jesus. Well, that would be a pretty hard way to start a conference on Asian American ministries. But it is a good overall reminder about how we are to keep our focus today and tomorrow in context. And let's be clear about what we do need to be clear about in what Paul is saying in this rubbish statement as we begin our time together. And one thing is this, that he certainly is telling us that our identity in Jesus Christ trumps everything else. That if we have to make a choice, the choice has to be for Jesus. I had a very inspiring moment in this regard back in the 1970s at an international gathering of educators from various Reformed institutions of Reformed and Presbyterian institutions of higher education from around the world, including both black and white delegates from South Africa, and this was during a time of apartheid. And a decision had been made to devote an evening of the conference to a debate about apartheid. And we had it in the auditorium in this place was full, bursting. And at one point, late in the proceedings, the president of a white Afrikaner university in South Africa was trying to defend his school's policies of racial segregation. And he told us that he hoped that the time would come when apartheid would end. But in the meantime, his university was going to go along with the racial practices of the larger society. He said it was very difficult to convince the majority of his white constituencies in the Dutch Reformed community that change had to take place. And then he added, with obvious pain in his voice, we cannot get too far ahead of our people on this subject. And at this point, a black South African theologian stood up, and he addressed the white leader, who was a friend. He addressed that white leader by his first name, and he said, you keep talking about your people. You have to educate your people. You cannot get too far ahead of your people. Well, I want to say as a black South African that I too love my people. But I also have to say this, he said, as difficult as it would be, I would forsake my people in order to be obedient to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's because, he said, belonging to Jesus is more important to me than my racial identity. So he said, I want to ask you, my friend, are you willing to forsake your people if the gospel of Jesus Christ demands it of you? And sadly, the white leader could not bring himself to say that. Well, that was in a very important moment in my own spiritual and theological journey. That black South African's powerful testimony brought home to me in a profound way the demands of the gospel with regard to issues of racial, cultural, national, and ethnic identity. If I genuinely believe what I'm saying, when I confess that I'm not my own, but belong to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ, if I genuinely believe that, then this has a profound implication for my understanding of who I am and what God has called me to be. That from here on in, as a follower of Jesus Christ, the only blood that defines me is not my ethnic blood, not my gender blood, not my American blood, but the blood of Jesus Christ that is bringing together a people from every tribe and tongue and nation of the earth. That's what Paul is certainly impressing upon us in Philippians 3, that we need to be absolutely clear what our commitment is, that what we are in the flesh has to be trumped by who we are in Jesus Christ. Now, in our discussions here the last time that many of us were gathered to talk about these things. My sense is that, what I learned there, my sense is that by being here, you've already made that fundamental commitment clear. Because Asian America may seem to many of us who listen to it as easy words to speak, but for many of you who are scarcely one generation away from deep wounds and grievings caused by each other's nations and ethnic groups, to say that there is a common Asian bond among Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Taiwanese, Hong Kong, people on the China mainland, people from generations that experienced war and oppression in the countries of Southeast Asia, to say that there's a generic Asian identity there is a very important commitment that you are making. And then to add a hyphenated American to that, after wars and bombings and detention camps here in the United States, is pretty serious stuff that we're talking about. So this gathering is itself a sign of God's renewing work in the world. This is a Pentecostal gathering in the best sense of the word, where people who have, many of you, spoken many different languages, each a different language, is coming together and celebrating what God is doing for all of us in Jesus Christ. And it's a symbol for me of the direction of God's more general work in the world, and that's why I find this discussion so important and exciting. You know, I'm a Dutch ethnic, raised grandparents on both sides, immigrants from the Netherlands. My grandfather, my grandmother on my mother's side belonged to a church in Passaic, New Jersey called the First Holland Reformed Church. And as a little kid, my grandparents didn't have a car. They were factory workers. As a little kid, I would go with my grandfather on Sunday afternoon to the Dutch language service. I didn't understand a word of it, but I was given the clear sense that it was very important for us to keep that language going. Many of you know that kind of experience in your own families and in your own church communities. Many years later, actually not too many years ago, my son and I went to look for that church. He wanted to see the church where I was baptized, the church where my grandparents had been very involved. And we found it, except it is no longer the First Holland Reformed Church, but it doesn't call itself church, it calls itself Iglesia. And we were out in the parking lot and looking at the cornerstone in which the words were still written, the Dutch words were still there. And a young Hispanic woman came out and said, "May I help you?" And I said, "This is the church of my childhood," and wanted to come. And she said, "Well, come on in," you know. And there was a group of young people who were practicing for some kind of worship, praise music in the basement. And my son and I went up into this large sanctuary and stood at the point where the baptismal font, we baptized babies, baptismal font was where I had been baptized. And as I stood at that spot, suddenly we heard a group of about 20 Hispanic American young people speaking in tongues. And I said to myself, this is what it's all about. In many ways, it's a sign of God's dealings in history that God, in the beginning, in response to the fall, called together an ethnic people, the people of Israel. I was speaking to a Jewish community meeting a couple years ago, and one of my rabbi friends introduced me to this Jewish group and said, Richard Mouw is a Calvinist. And he always says that about me, and he says, you know, I have a hard time believing it because he's got a sense of humor. But and afterward, a Jewish couple, an older Jewish couple, came up and said, you know, we really enjoyed what you had to say, but we were really puzzled by what Rabbi said. He said, you're a Calvinist? And I said, yes, I am. And they said, well, that's surprising. And I said, why? They said, well, you seem like such a nice guy. And I said, well, why wouldn't I be a nice guy as a Calvinist? Like, don't you believe that, like, God chooses some and not others? And I said, yeah, like God chose the Israelites and not the Jebusites or the Midianites or the Philistines. And they looked at me kind of strange, and they said, yeah, we're going to have to think about that, you know. But God did have a focus on a specific ethnic people, but there were those many times, and especially if you read through the book of Isaiah, where God says it's too light a thing, he says to the prophet, too small a thing for you to be raised up simply to serve the tribes of Israel and Judah. I want to make my will known to the nations of the earth. Where God says in that wonderful chapter in Isaiah that someday, and then he mentions two of Israel's enemies, that someday Assyria will build an altar to God, and there will be a highway between Assyria and Egypt and Israel. And on that day I will say, Assyria are my people. Israel is the work of my hands, and Egypt are my chosen ones. You know, that someday God would expand that vision to the nations of the earth, and you have experienced that in your own commitment to Asian American. Well, what about all this? Well, one thing is that about ethnic identity that we learned from Paul, I think, is that we're not to absolutize it, but we are, I think, that doesn't rule out having a legitimate affection for it, you know. I discovered after 9/11 that I got patriotic again. I'm a product of the 60s. I used to protest the war and all kinds of things like that. And all of a sudden I found myself kind of shedding tears when people sang the national anthem and the like. And I've been thinking a lot about patriotism. And you know, patriotism is a lot, I mean, the word patriotism comes from the word father, or you can talk about the motherland. And it's a lot like our relationship with our parents. It's not a bad thing for us to have affection for our parents. In fact, if you send your mother a Mother's Day card and it says, you're the greatest mother on the face of the earth, you know, that's probably not true. It's hyperbolic, huh? But it's not wicked to say that, you know. It gets a little more difficult when we say to our nation, you're the greatest nation on the face of the earth, because we got bombs and all kinds of things that we seem so eager to use to back that up. But an affection for one's own people, an affection for one's country, an affection for one's tradition, an affection for one's family, for one's ethnic group, it's not a bad thing. As long as we keep it on the level of an affection and not an idolatry, not an absolutizing. And then secondly, it's important for us to keep those memories alive. Simon Chan, many of you know his work, a Pentecostal theologian in Singapore, put it well a while back in an interview that he had with Christianity Today. He said there's a danger in resisting change in our efforts to serve the Lord. He says, but in my view, in the modern world especially, the danger of a short memory far outweighs the danger of not being willing to change. That we can't be afflicted with a kind of cultural, ethnic, or theological amnesia. That we do have to keep the memories alive. That the neglect of the past is a dangerous thing. And it's crucial that we not forgive our past, that we not forget our roots. That we have to be willing to change, but we must do so without also preserving our spiritual and theological and ethnic memories, keeping them alive. So for those of you who are not far removed from the immigrant experience, recognizing that there are important theological resources in those memories that we need to draw upon. I often recite a wonderful essay by a former archbishop in the Catholic Church, Rembert Weakland, Archbishop of Milwaukee. He said, we Catholics have a real challenge today. He said, you know, for all of the 20th century, Catholicism basically catechized people to survive as immigrants on the margins of a dominant culture. Irish Catholics, Polish Catholics, Italian Catholics. He said the big problem is that we have people who spiritually and theologically were trained to be survivors on the margins of culture, but now they're lawyers and doctors and heads of multinational corporations and even in the president's cabinet. You know. But they haven't yet learned what it means to exercise the power of leadership in a culture because their spirituality and the theology with which they were raised was a spirituality and theology of marginalization. That's true of many of our ethnic immigrant communities today. That we've seen a magnificent change in recent years, of course, where many of us were raised to sing, "This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through," and now instead we sing, "Shine, Jesus shine, fill this land with the Father's glory." We belong here. But it's important for us to take both of those songs seriously, that we stand between "this world is not my home" and "fill this land with the Father's glory," which probably isn't going to happen very soon. And in the meantime, we have to ask, what is God calling us to do to be His people? As an exile people, but a people who are called to serve Him. As God said to His people in the time of their exile in the Old Testament, build houses and live in them in Babylon, plant vineyards and eat the fruit thereof, marry off your sons and daughters and multiply in the land. Many of our immigrant communities have done a good job at that. Then he goes on to say, but seek the welfare, the shalom of the city in which I've placed you in this time of exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare you will find your welfare. And it's my prayer for this conference that there will be much shalom that emerges, working for the shalom of the whole church, but also working for the shalom of the larger human community, but doing so, keeping the memories alive of where God has brought you from and where God has placed you today. May the Lord be with us as we engage in these important discussions, and thank you.